we have our kings of Judah. We have been studying all these guys. We've looked at Josiah already. We're going to look at him again tonight a little bit. And you see all of those guys. Notice Jehoshaphat, number 4. We're going to go back this coming Sunday and look at a little bit of him, teach us a little bit about Thanksgiving. All right, so that's the kings of Judah we've studied so far. Notice Josiah is from 640 to 609 BC. All right, notice when Rehoboam was. 931 BC. How many years approximately is that difference? 300 years, okay? 300 and some odd years, okay? Approximately between Rehoboam and Josiah. Now, the nation of Judah did not get taken away by the Babylonians until 586 BC. So there's a few more years left, but Josiah was the last good king that they had. All right, and we're gonna look at a little bit of that tonight. Next, we see the kings of Israel. We've studied all of these guys. Go to the next page. We've studied all these guys. Remember, Hoshea was the last one, 722 BC. The Assyrians came in and took over and took them away to basically be seen no more, to just be out into the crowd. Next, you see this golden calf. Turn to 1 Kings, if you would. 1 Kings tonight, chapter number 12. 1 Kings, chapter number 12. Now, tonight we're going to talk about Jeroboam and we're going to talk about Josiah. Jeroboam was the first king of the nation of Israel after Solomon died. Remember, it broke into 2 nations. Rehoboam took Judah. Solomon's son, took Judah. Jeroboam, not related to any of them, he took Israel, the northern kingdom. Now you remember Jeroboam was a great king. Was he not a good, godly king? Right? No, he wasn't. He was not. Matter of fact, how many of the northern kings were good? 0. None of them. That's correct. None of the 19 were good. They were all bad. And so Jeroboam started it off, and he started it off good, did he not? Notice what it says here in 1 Kings chapter 12. Remember over in 2 Kings, we showed you where when God took away the nation of Israel, he said it was because of Jeroboam and what Jeroboam did. What did Jeroboam do 200 and something years before that? Well, it says, whereupon, verse 28, the king took counsel. This is King Jeroboam. And he made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. And he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. He made a house of high places, made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah, and he offered upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, of sacrificing unto the calves that he had made. He placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel. He offered upon the altar and burned incense. All right, so we know he changed the object, he changed the place, he changed the time, and all of those things when it came to their worship. Now, Jeroboam builds these calves and puts one in the north, one in the south of Israel. And then he decides that he wants to go to Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month. It was the Feast of Tabernacles was supposed to be the 15th day of the 7th month. But he said, we're going to have our own feast. I'm going to do it when I want to do it. Y'all know any kings or anybody that just says, I'm going to do it the way I'm going to do it no matter what? That's kind of sad, is it not? Well, Jeroboam said, I don't care what God says about it, so I'm just going to do it my way. And so he did this. Now, verse 1 of chapter 13. Let's continue into the story. And behold, by the way, when you do wrong, guess what's coming? A word from God. Okay? A word from God. Somehow, some way, somewhere, a word from God is going to come to you. And behold, there came a man of God out of Judah. All right, now he came out of the southern kingdom up to the northern kingdom, to where Jeroboam was, out of Judah by the word of the Lord unto Bethel, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. All right, so here's Jeroboam out on the 15th day of the 8th month, on the day that he set the feast for. He said, I'm going to burn incense. I'm going to make some sacrifices here on the altar that I've made. By the way, kings are not supposed to be making sacrifices anyhow. course, this is an idolatrous altar, but kings are not supposed to be making sacrifices. Only the priests were. But here's a king, and you remember when Uzziah went into the temple to burn incense unto the Lord, what happened to him? Leprosy, that's exactly right. The high priest followed him in there and said, you don't belong in there. And he said, who are you telling me what to do, buddy? God struck him down with leprosy. Now, here Jeroboam is making, burning incense, offering sacrifices on his altar that he has made, and God sends a man of God to him to tell him about it. All right? Verse number 2, and he, this prophet, this preacher, this man of God, cried against the altar in the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign which the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be rent, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. And so what we have here is we have a man of God coming from Judah up to Bethel to the northern kingdom and telling Jeroboam, who has done wrong, he said, one day there's going to be a king of Judah, one of David's sons. It's his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. It's going to be one of David's sons that's going to come and going to tear this altar down and burn men's bones upon it. Burn these priests' bones upon it. That's what he said. Now, Jeroboam, 931 BC. Josiah, 640 BC, when he took over to be the king. How many years is that different? 300 and something years. 300 and something years. Here is this man of God who prophesies to Jeroboam around 930 BC about this man that's going to be born 300 and some odd years hence. And he called him by his name. And he said it's going to be Josiah. Josiah is going to be the one that's going to do it. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I kind of like the Bible. Y'all like the Bible? Do y'all think it's a fantastic book? Do you think it is God's book to us, God's love letter to us? Do you think it is inspired, infallible, inerrant, complete, sufficient? Do you believe all those things about the Word of God tonight? Do you believe that God can give somebody a word of prophecy that he can prophesy and then 300 years later the prophecy comes true? Let me tell you something. God can do that. That's not the only instance in the Bible, by the way, that there's years apart in this, which if we have time as we go along, we're going to see a couple of others, at least one other. Now, Josiah is called by name some 300 and some odd years before he is even born. Now, I got to read the rest of this, a little bit more of this story, though, just to remind you what it was. Because when we talked about Jeroboam a year and a half ago or whatever, we preached about this. Verse 4, and it came to pass when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar in Bethel, that he put forth his hand from the altar, saying, lay hold on him. You remember that? Jeroboam standing there, and this man of God says, listen, buddy, you're doing wrong. God doesn't like what you're doing. There's going to be a man by the name of Josiah born one day that's going to come up here and tear this thing down. And Jeroboam said, I don't like you. Guards, get him. He puts his hand out. Guards, get him. Go lay your hand on him. Well, notice verse 4, it says, and his hand which he put forth against him dried up so that he could not pull it in again to him. It just kind of went paralyzed like, I mean, just kind of limp, I guess. And of course, verse 5 says, the altar also was rent, was torn. The ashes poured out from the altar according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. So Jeroboam puts his hand out and says, go get him. And you know what God did with it, with his hand? With God's hand? God took his hand from heaven and goes, and just turns it all sorts of which ways, and here it is hanging down here like this. Y'all think God can do that? I guarantee he can do that. And that's exactly what he did. Then, notice verse 6, the king answered and said unto the man of God, entreat now the face of the Lord thy God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored me again. All of a sudden now he does believe in God and the power of God. He said, would you pray and ask God to make my hand well again? I told you what I would do, right? He said, make my hand like the other one. I said, okay, we'll do that. We'll pray that. All right. Where this one will be limp too. Type thing. But this man did pray and did that. Now, I want you to go, if you would, over to 2 Kings. 2 Kings, all right? You know the basis of the story here. Go over to 2 Kings. Now, we are 350 years later, okay, in history. All right, we have gone past over 30 decades here in the Bible and in history. And Josiah has now become the king. And how old was he when he became king? 8 years old. 8 years old when he became the king. His daddy Ammon was a very wicked man, only lasted 2 years. Josiah lasted 31 years. He became king when he was 8 years old. And to think when he became king at 8 and only lasted 31 years, he died kind of young, did he not? 39, that's kind of young. But man, what a great king he was. Now, you remember that when Josiah took over, he began to seek the Lord. He wanted God's will to be done. He didn't like all those idols. He knew that. But then they found the book of the law as they were cleaning out the temple, and they came and read it to the king, and he was so convicted by the reading of the Word of God. And so he said, we are in trouble. We have forsaken the Lord, and we need to get back right with God. And so he read it to all the people, and all the people said, yeah, let's get right with God. And so you know what they started doing? They started going from place to place and getting rid of all the idols and tearing them down and grinding them up and getting rid of them. And so they did that throughout all the land of Judah. Now, at this time, Assyria had already come in and wiped out the northern kingdom. But you know what? There were still people, there were some Jews there, but then they had repeopled the place, repopulated the place with other people, and they were still worshiping go back to the frame before that, these people were still worshiping at these golden calves worship centers. This was actually some 80 to 100 years after Assyria had wiped out the north. These things were still there. And you remember these people were worshiping every god they could think of. Well, these things were still there. But it had been prophesied for 300 years before this that a man of God, a king would be born, a son of David would be born by the name of Josiah that would come out there and wipe out this thing in Bethel by this man of God. Here's where it happened right here. 2 Kings 23. And they've been going throughout all the land of Judah, breaking all the high places and tearing this place up. And so somebody says, well, King, don't you know that there's something up here at Bethel and that you're supposed to go up here and tear this up? And he said, well, let's go do it. And so verse 15 says, moreover, the altar that was at Bethel. All right, this was not even in Judah. This was in the northern kingdom of Israel, where Jeroboam had set up shop. Moreover, the altar that was at Bethel in the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, had made, both that altar and the high place he, Josiah, brake down and burned the high place and stamped it small to powder and burned the grove. And so here, we go back to 1 Kings chapter 12 and 13, and we see this altar being built, and then this man of God coming and crying against it and said, Josiah is going to be born, and he's going to tear this thing up one day. 350 years later, here is a man that's tearing it up, and you know what his name is? It's Josiah. Is that a coincidence? Or is that God? That's God. Now, I ask you this. Do you think that God knows anything about you? You think God knows anything about you? I'm going to tell you right now, God knows everything about you. Now, He does not send people today, to prophesy. Matter of fact, you don't even want to know your future, okay? You think you may want to know your future. You really don't want to know your future, okay? If you knew that something bad was going to happen to you in 6 months, the next 6, and all you do is fret about that for 6 months. That wouldn't be fun, would it? So, but God doesn't do that today, but yet God knows all about it. And the Bible even talks about how that He knows our future. He cares for us. He loves for us. And I got news for you. We have a bright future because of the love of God and the caring of God. I believe that. Now, it says in verse 16, it says, and as Josiah turned himself, he spied the sepulchres that were there in the mount. Now, remember, he was supposed to tear down the altar, but he was also supposed to burn some bones on it. And he sent and took the bones out of the sepulchres and burned them upon the altar and polluted it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these words. Somebody said, well, there was somebody that talked about this was going to happen. Do y'all believe that the Lord's coming back one day? Now, there's a lot of people don't believe that. And, every day gets us closer to that day, but the Lord's coming back. And you know what we're going to say one day? That's what He said. That's what He said. Now, I don't know if, these people had thought too much about Josiah and them coming and all this kind of stuff, but now they got to the point 350 years later, and they said, okay, here it is. It was proclaimed. It was proclaimed. And here it's now happening. Here's an interesting thought, though. Look at verse number 17. Then he said, what title is that I see? And the men of the city told him, it is the sepulchre of the man of God, which came from Judah, and proclaimed these things that thou hast done against the altar of Bethel. You remember that man ended up dying before he could go back because he listened to another, quote, prophet. Remember the lion got him and the lion waited for him and all that? Don't have time to read it all, but you can go back and read it later. And verse 18, and he, Josiah, said, let him alone. Let no man move his bones. Now, if that was, many people in the world today say, oh, that's a man of God. Yeah, dig him up. Let's burn him too. But righteous Josiah said, no, let no man move his bones. So they let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet that came out of Samaria. And so now, we introduced you to Josiah this past Sunday. Jeroboam, we've talked about him many times. He's the reason Northern Kingdom's no more. But even way back when Jeroboam took over and made his calf, here comes this preacher who said, God said you ought not to be doing this. And there's going to be a man born one day by the name of Josiah. And he's going to take away, he's going to get rid of this particular altar here at Bethel. Now, it's amazing to me. It's just absolutely amazing. All right, I want you to go to the book of Isaiah. And let's go to the next slide up here if we can, gentlemen. That's the altar being torn down by Josiah and his men. Next then, we see King Cyrus. Y'all ever heard of King Cyrus of Persia? Go to Isaiah 44. Now, I know that I speak fast and I give a lot of facts out, and I know it's hard to kind of hang with me, but let's talk about Judah now. And Judah ends their particular reign in 586 BC under Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar comes in and wipes them out. Nebuchadnezzar, okay, just making sure. I think that's a puppy or something. Nebuchadnezzar was a Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on the face of the earth. He was allowed by God to wipe out the nation of Judah. Now, go to the next slide. Let me see. Do I have that up there? Go to the next slide after that. Okay, here it is. The book of Daniel had prophesied that there would be these particular world powers. And he did this, of course, by this great statue that he saw. The head of gold was to be Babylon, the breast of silver was to be Persia, the thighs of brass Greece, the legs of iron Rome, and then feet of iron and clay, the divided nations up until the present. And we're not studying prophecy here tonight, but that's basically a prophetical statement, because what happens here is all of these nations then became world dominant powers. And God said it. And all I'm telling you tonight is God says something, it's going to happen, all right? It may not happen when you think it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. Now today, right now, you're saved, okay? If you're a Christian tonight, you're saved. But you're really still to see the fulfillment of that, okay? When your faith one day will become, as the song says, sight. Okay, that's still to happen. And that's still going to happen. And folks, you can mark it down. It's going to happen. Just as all of these things took place. We had Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. We had Persia under Cyrus. And then Darius. And then we had Greece, who was Alexander the Great. And we had Rome, of course, who was the Caesars. We know Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. And even God had His way with all of these people. All right, flip back to Cyrus, if you can. And let's look here in Isaiah 44, the last verse of the chapter. And I'm gonna again, the Bible is so wonderful. It's just so marvelous. Verse 28, that saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Now, Isaiah wrote this approximately 150 years before Cyrus was ever born. And 180 years before it ever took place, where he became the king of Persia. He, through Isaiah, God mentions His name as being the one. See, the Jews went into captivity. We're not quite there yet in our overall study. We're to Josiah, and then there's 4 or 5 more kings after him, 4 more kings after him, and then they go into Babylonian captivity, and basically the prophets had told him they're only going to be there 70 years, and then there's going to be a man by the name of Cyrus who is going to be risen up, who is going to rise up, and he is going to let you go back, and he's going to let you rebuild Jerusalem, and he's going to let you rebuild the temple. That was written 150 years before Cyrus was even born. Now, so we fast forward to the time of their being gone and being deported into captivity, and then the Persians take over from the Babylonians, and it just so happens the guy that is on the throne, his name is Cyrus. And you have to say, is that a coincidence? Is that a coincidence? No, it's not. And what does Cyrus say? And see, you read Josephus. Josephus is not Bible, but he was a Jewish historian. And you read Josephus, and he talks about how the fact that people had even told Cyrus when he took over that he was written about in the Bible, that prophets had talked about him. And he went and read the prophecies, and then he knew that he was the man that God had risen, had brought to that point in life to use in that way. And so when Cyrus found out about that, he had no problem in telling those folks they could go back to the land. How would you like this? You're born and, you're growing up and everything's good. One time you're Harley's age. Harley, you're 14, 13, 15, 18, 20. 13, right, Jack? 13. All right, Cyrus used to be 13, and then he used to be 25, and then he used to be 30, and then he took over as king, and then somebody's telling him his name's in the Bible, in essence. Now, that would be cool, wouldn't it? Go read the Bible and see your name, that it's been prophesied about you, that you're going to be a king one day, and you're going to be the one to let the Jews go. And guess where all these people are around you? It's all these Jews that are around you, and they're asking you if they can go back. And of course, you're going to say yes. And God let them go back under Zerubbabel and Ezra, and then later on, of course, Nehemiah. And all of that, all the stories. And they went back and rebuilt the walls, and they rebuilt the temple. God allowed them to go back into the land. Now, the northern kingdom never was allowed to go back, but the southern kingdom was allowed to go back. And a lot of it had to do with Josiah even. But here, 150 years. We talked about Josiah being mentioned by name 300 or 350 years before it actually took place. And it was Josiah who went and took care of Jeroboam's altar. Here we have Cyrus who was born, and there's other verses here in chapter 45. Look at verse 1 of chapter 45 of Isaiah. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. And he talked about all of these things, but and how that he was going to bless Cyrus, and he was going to use Cyrus. I want you to go back to Ezra. Go back to Ezra. Go back to the book of Ezra. There's Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. There's 2 Chronicles, Ezra. I love it. Ezra chapter 1. Coincidence or God? Verse 1 of chapter 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, how did we know that was going to happen? Isaiah had talked about it. That the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold, with goods, with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Cyrus prophesied. There's another great man, and I got about 2 minutes. Go to the next slide. Now, Alexander the Great is not mentioned by name, but you go to Daniel chapter 8, and I believe Daniel chapter 11, and you study some of those verses, and we'll not do it tonight to have time, but you would be amazed at how Alexander the Great is described, the prince of Greece, basically. And see, go to the next slide. You have Babylon. The main guy in Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar. You had Persia, Cyrus, and then later on Darius. And of course, even some of the Artaxerxes and some of those guys that are involved in Esther and some of those kind of things. Okay? But we know some of those guys. Greece became a world dominant power. Do you know who was the head of Greece? Alexander the Great. Now, he's not mentioned by name. He's not prophesied like Josiah was and like Cyrus was by name, but yet he is prophesied of his coming. And you read some of those verses and you have to say, my goodness. My goodness. And see, even Alexander the Great, we are told by history that he believed these things as well. Let me see if I can find that. It says that here's what happened. Here's what happened. Alexander knew that he was going to defeat the Persian Empire because, see, here's the thing. It had already been written in prophecy, basically. You know, the Persians would be defeated and this and that and the other, okay? So he understood what was getting ready to happen. And Alexander had a great victory over the Persians. When, let me remember exactly the way it went here. He ended up in Jerusalem. Alexander the Great was going to attack Jerusalem and was going to take over Jerusalem. It said when he got to Jerusalem, he accompanied the priests into Jerusalem, into the temple where he offered sacrifice to God, according to the high priest's direction, magnificently treated both the high priest and the priest. And he was then shown the book of Daniel. And he was shown that it was him, of course. And then it is said that Alexander the Great did not take over Jerusalem. He let the Jews live peacefully in their own way. And then, of course, the Romans ended up taking it over from the Greeks. But all of this is prophesied in Daniel and all of these things. And so we see these prophecies. We see Josiah mentioned 350 years that he was going to, earlier, that he was going to take care of Jeroboam's altar. We see Cyrus mentioned 150 years before he was even born, and that he was going, of course, to allow the Jews to come back. And lo and behold, it all happened. I tell you, that's not coincidence, that's God. Y'all think God can work in our lives? All things work together for good to them that love God. It's not always fun. A lot of times it's painful, but you know all things work together for good. God can do that. I believe it with all my heart. Matter of fact, whatever God says in this book, I believe He can and will do it. He can and will do it. I tell you, folks, this is something else. This is something else. I love it. I hope that you do tonight.